if we were to map all of the military industrial jobs in this country, physically map them, they would be sort of like just spread across the country, almost like you would, I don't know, put cream cheese on a piece of on a bagel or something. They're just like all the way across, and and distributed that way. Was that both push and pull? In other words, was it like Congress people saying like, we've got this, they want to build, some defense hawk wants to build a helicopter. Well, I'm going to the company, Grantham Northup or whoever it is building this. I'm going to go to them and say, like, you got to put a plant in, my district. And if you do, you got my vote. And then some other congressman says, well, we'll make the rotors and you guys will make the, and that's how it works, right? It's like a sort of a push and a pull.
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, I think you have certainly as the Cold War defense industry is forming in the 50s and 60s, you have a very deliberate effort by particularly people, congressmen, they're almost all men in the 50s and 60s, who are clamoring for defense contracts in the district. There's one famous example of a congressman from South Carolina named Mendel Rivers, who had the nickname of Rivers Delivers, because Rivers was the key proponent of defense spending in his district in South Carolina. He was just advocating for more military spending, more military defense plants, more bases, to the point that one of his colleagues said, Mendel's, if you put one more military base in your district, it's going to sink into the Atlantic Ocean. So there's a deep desire for politicians to benefit from this. But of course, as you're saying, well, then these jobs come in, and then it's a zero-sum game, right? Like you get a defense contract for this part, but you're not that defense contract when it runs out, when the machine or part or a plane or whatever is built, then that contract is limited and people want the contract again. And then people who are benefiting from that lobby their representative, write letters to the president even. And looking to get what they had back. And then when it's a zero-sum game too, you have people saying, well, people like Mendel Rivers, he's getting all these defense contracts. What about me? And they're looking to also benefit from this as well. So there's an effort by Congress to bring defense into these districts. There's then a pushback from people on the ground who are benefiting from the defense industry, whether they're employed by it or not. If they're serving coffee or working at a store that's frequented by defense employees, then they're going to benefit from this too. They're pushing back for more, and so it's this zero-sum game that really shapes how we think about politics and the way that defense spending and foreign policy affects our lives in these material ways.
And so as we enter into the 60s and the early 70s, there's a pushback. There's an anti-militarism, at least in this country. But does that have any material impact on how we spend money? And I mean, do we ever get a contraction in this in a sustained way during any period since we built it in the 50s?
Not in the sense of there are dips, there are ebbs and flows to defense spending. So in terms of GDP, for instance, defense spending never is equivalent to what it was during World War II. It was when 42% of GDP, and then the Korean War, it goes up to 17% of GDP. Vietnam, it's 9% of GDP, and now it's about 4 or 5%. So in terms of GDP, it's never equivalent. And I take that into account in terms of how I think about defense spending, as people aren't benefiting economically in the same ways that they were during World War II, and they're trying to get that back. But in terms of the actual increasing of the numbers of the defense budget, it doesn't go down in any significant way. In fact, it keeps going up. In terms of the actual numbers, now, of course, the current fiscal year defense budget is over $750 billion, and that's the largest it's ever been. So it doesn't go down. But the New Left in the 60s and anti-war movement, what it does is it doesn't necessarily affect the material circumstances, but it draws attention to the ways in which the military industrial complex produces waste and inefficiency, and can be a contributing factor in terms of maintaining a Cold War economy and Cold War foreign policy in certain ways. And you see in Congress, for the first time really during the Cold War, Democrats and Republicans too, to a certain extent, feeling that they need to cut certain programs. They need to cut these planes that aren't necessary anymore. They need to, there's this one plane called the C-5A plane that has the wingspan the size of a football field. That's producing waste. Lockheed almost goes bankrupt in 1971 because of that. And there's this overwhelming critique of the military-industrial complex that shapes how we think about defense spending. But what I argue is that by the mid-1970s, by 73, 74, when there's an overwhelming crisis in the economy produced by many reasons, but inflation and through a lack of oil production, and there are other reasons too, but and unemployment, then you have a greater clamoring for the defense industry to bring back jobs and for people who are employed by the defense industry to keep jobs. So the New Left has this real and the anti-war movement has this real key moment and forceful moment in shaping American culture in the late 60s and early 70s. But it doesn't make an impact materially because it can't do that within this larger, growing, creeping context of austerity that the country is facing in the early 70s.
And then we head into the 80s. Ronald Reagan, of course, is there's a whole new sort of era of militarism. Although I also remember, there was also like, we just paid $75 for, or like $100 or $250 for a hammer. That was like the big, that was the sort of, this is how we're going to deal with the military. We're just going to change the procurement or we're going to make it look like what we're doing is cutting down on waste as opposed to the entire thing is wasteful.
Yeah, I mean, that's the famous, like $5,000 toilet seat or whatever it was in the Pentagon, I think, and then that's the point, though, is that the cost overruns are endemic to the industry. Like it's supposed to function like that. That's a product of the privatization of military spending. There are some people, you mentioned Galbraith, like there are some people like James Conner Galbraith who said, well, we should just nationalize the defense industry, just take it over, and then get these private interests out of the business of war, and then you can really determine when national security is necessary or when you need to produce certain weapons for national security reasons, right? Which arguably during the Cold War are certainly limited, right? And I think that that's one thing to think about, but is how these industries sort of like extract funds from the Pentagon. And there's no oversight, right? There still is no oversight in the Pentagon, as much as there's been calls both by Republicans and Democrats to create some sort of watchdog group that could see how the defense industry is just taking money from taxpayers and spending it on these ridiculous programs like the F-35 is one example too, right? This is this big example of a plane that's being produced that is not going to overall benefit national security interests, and we're spending billions of dollars on it. I think if there was some sort of democratic accountability for that, then you would obviously have greater push on the industry to change things and for the Pentagon to change things. But there isn't, and I think Reagan is one of the reasons why there isn't that those institutions created, why those people don't exist to actually challenge the power of the industry.
Is 9/11 the other reason? I mean, because we're 40 years out now, and I mean, if I was to meet a stranger, if an alien was to come down and say like, yeah, no, we had this massive buildup of our military because the United States was afraid of the Soviet Union, and then one day they were gone, like literally. And so what did you do with all that money? We just kept spending it. We just kept trying to find a new, like we had to find a new, we had to find a new
big bad.
Yeah. I mean, that's what's amazing about it is the sort of the durability. There was that brief hiccup where it was like, we're going to have a peace dividend, and people were talking about, we're going to recalculate the GDP. I remember there was that movement that was like around that time in the early 90s. And then I don't know. Bill Clinton just is consumed by his scandal, and the politics seem to go away. I mean, or just people get excited about Y2K, and then we're on to 9/11. It feels like.
Yeah, I mean, 9/11 is a transformative moment. I mean, what's really interesting to me is, 9/11 obviously changes defense spending in the military-industrial complex and how we think about war in obvious ways. But in the 90s, there's this question, as you're saying, of what do we do with this military? Like, what do we do with these programs? What do we do with these bases? And there is by Clinton in some measure limited, but to close military bases, there are some bases closed in California and converted to shopping malls and things like that. But what you start to see in the 90s, and I didn't get this too much just in my book, but I've written about this in other places, and there are other scholars who are writing about this as well, but is the transferring of Pentagon equipment to police departments, right? This is the 90s, is what do we do with this, and the militarization of the police. You get the 1033 program in 97. You get the Budget Enforcement Act in 1990, which prevents defense funds from being allocated to social welfare projects. All this sort of question of like, what strategically do we do with this now we don't have this enemy? And that then we should obviously consider that in the context of humanitarian intervention and other questions that arise from America's involvement in places like Somalia, for instance, and and other parts of the world. But anyway, this to me is really interesting and shapes the coming of 9/11, right? The 90s, the militarization of the police, the militarization of American culture, the militarization of American society, where you start to see our police departments looking like, having tanks and looking like they're prepared for war. And then 9/11 happens, and then you have the creation of the Homeland Security Act, the Homeland Security Department. That's going to shape how people in the national security apparatus go after suspected terrorists. And the 90s, I think, is this key formative moment that transforms defense spending both at home and abroad, and really comes to shape us in ways that I don't think we reconciled with yet.